sessions, including a session with a group, I think, which is a caucus of DSA called the Marxist Unity Group, based in New Jersey, I think. And a part of the reason people got requests from people in DSA is because of a book I wrote on Lenin's electoral strategy. It's not really the correct title for the book, but the original publisher wouldn't let me use the title I wanted. What Lenin called what he was doing called revolutionary parliamentarism, but the publisher didn't think that would have much of an appeal to audiences, so I had to concede to Lenin's electoral strategy, which is really not a strategy, but okay, we'll talk about that later. I thought I'd begin with a clip. It's about 7 minutes. It's about 7 minutes on the NewsHour 2 weeks ago. And the reason for it, I think, is it illustrates what many people oftentimes ask, well, what exactly is capitalism? And I think this is a good way to begin with this clip. Having some trouble with the volume, so it's we closed captioned it.
Freight trains are getting longer and longer in the U.S., some stretching for 2 or 3 miles. These longer trains allow for more goods to move more efficiently, which lowers fuel use and costs for the railroads. But as William Brangham explains, these trains, especially when they stall, are also cutting some communities in half.
The impact of these longer trains on the daily lives of Americans is the focus of a new investigative report from Investigate TV and ProPublica. It highlights the journey of children on their way to school in the rural town of Hammond, Indiana, where parked trains create a literal roadblock for kids, and they're forced to crawl over and under them to get to school. Another concern, long trains can halt traffic, stranding ambulances, fire trucks, and other emergency vehicles. And for the record, BNSF Railways, which is mentioned in some of this reporting, is a funder of the NewsHour. For a closer look at all of this, we are joined by one of the reporters on this series, Josie Sturman of Investigate TV. Welcome to the NewsHour.
Thanks for having me.
Those images of those children crawling under and over those stalled trains is just so jarring. I want to read a bit from your report here. It says, an 8th grade girl waited 10 minutes before she made her move, nervously scrutinizing the gap between 2 cars. She'd seen plenty of trains start without warning. I don't want to get crushed, she said. These stalled trains can literally start at any time.
Any moment, no notice, and these children are just waiting. They wait at the bus stop in the morning to see if they can get through. They'll collect in large populations. Their parents are sometimes with them. They'll look under the train. They'll listen for noises, any indications that it might be moving. When they feel like it's no left choice, they're out. They go. They give it a try, and they risk their lives doing it.
It's just so striking to me that a train is not required to sound a signal or make a clear, demonstrable sound before it takes off.
They definitely have some sort of signal, but as you mentioned, these trains could be miles long. So even if they honk a horn or give some sort of a warning light at the front of the train, the odds that the kids at the back or at the middle are going to hear that may not happen.
Right.
So there is no notice, and they're in the most dangerous sections of these trains, crawling through, crawling under, so not having any notice is a really big problem.
Why are these trains stalled and stopped the way they are? Is this a mechanical breakdown? What is happening?
Breakdowns can definitely be a factor when this is an issue, but that's just one reason. Another is rail traffic. You know, it's basically switching practices. They might need to get one train into one place, another into another, and they need different lanes or space to do it. It could also be a crew timeout issue, just like with airplanes and pilots. When they hit a certain number of hours, they have to shift out, they have to get rest. It's very important. So there are a number of factors that mean they stop. Now, best practices would say they would stop what they say off crossing in an area where they're not going to impact the community, say like Hammond or anywhere else in the country where this happens. But that's not exactly what happens most of the time, because they want the trains to be in the fastest, most efficient place to move forward and keep the process going. So if that means they stop in the middle of a community and they limit the first responders, they cut off communities, that's the cost of doing business, I guess.
This issue
response compensating for this, knowing that it's a problem. Not everybody can do it. The rail lines have been there for decades, so they can't always do that. They try to plan routes around that. Doesn't always work. We know that there have been deaths as a result of this. We've seen fires, we've seen injuries. It's very real, because if it takes them miles out of their way to respond, that's the time they're not getting to you, and that has real life implications.
I want to play a clip from an interview that you did with a firefighter in Hammond, Indiana, who was talking about the pushback that they've tried to do when they've gone to the industry about this. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The cities and towns and states have tried to challenge the railroads. Obviously, the railroads have come out well ahead, and so I don't know if they're giving us, the middle finger and saying we're going to do it because we want in court, or if they're just ignoring it. But we need help. We need help.
The Association of American Railroads, we reached out to them. They said safety is our top priority. What has the railroad industry told you in regards to your reporting?
Same thing. Safety is their priority, but at the moment, they pretty much have all the power here. This is a regulatory gray issue, so no one forces them to move. Nobody can tell them they can move. No one can really fine them. This is an issue where it's been fought in court. It's now potentially going to go to the Supreme Court. Attorneys general across the country are fighting to get some sort of decision on who's in charge here, because right now, no one is. So they can do what they want, and safety may be their top priority. They don't want to see these accidents either, but the demonstration here is they're willing to sit and wait in many communities, and they're not doing anything about it. So obviously, safety isn't always the top priority. The rail union themselves, the people who are the engineers and the conductors, have said today it was about greed, it's about money, it's about them making money, and that's what they see as the priority. They're not showing that safety is the first priority. If they're willing to let these trains sit for days or at a time, it's just a crisis.
I know you've talked to lawmakers here in D.C., including Secretary Buttigieg at the Department of Transportation. What is the ideal remedy here that lawmakers would like to see done?
The remedy is potentially fining repeat operators, but that seems like a long shot at this point. The remedy could also be deciding who actually regulates this problem, who can tell them they can move, because as I said, it's a gray area, nobody really can at this point. At the moment, the only thing they have is funding, and there's going to be grants given out by the Department of Transportation to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars to just try to get rid of these at-grade crossings altogether. That's the only thing they have at the moment. There is safety legislation moving through as a result of the situation in Ohio with the hazmat situation. They're going to try to do a few things with that to address blocked crossings, but it's not anything specific in terms of regulation. So this isn't going to get solved through regulation at the moment or through legislation at the moment, and all they have is money to throw at the problem.
Josie Sturman of Investigate TV, such tremendous reporting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought this would be a good place to begin to talk about exactly what is capitalism. And it seems to me that there are at least two issues that are going on here. And people may have seen other things that we can discuss. The railroads behave the way they do because it's cost efficient. It's cheaper that way to do what they do. It's no great mystery. They make money behaving in the way that they do. I think for most people that's fairly clear. There's the other side of it. Why can't they get away with it? That to me, I think, is the more interesting question. Why are they able to do what they do? And you got a little bit of a glimpse of this with some of the government regulators, what government regulators do or cannot, won't do, and so on. And that to me, perhaps, is the more important issue and the discussion I'd like to talk with you tonight about the politics of this. That's I think is the more significant issue. You may have seen that shot towards the end from East Palestine, Ohio. That was back in January. That was that train derailment that took place. 3 months earlier, maybe 2 months earlier, the Biden administration evoked 1918-1920 law that forced railroad workers back to work. Railroad workers were willing to go out on strike on these questions. They've been complaining about this problem and similar related problems for years. And they tried to use union power, use the power of their unions to go out. And they were prevented. They were prevented from going out on strike. The Biden administration forced them back to work. The situation in East Palestine, Ohio, is people are still not gotten back. The situation has not gotten back to normal. All of the toxic soil that's still in place in East Palestine. This is exactly what the railroads have been complaining about. The workers have been complaining about for years. Imagine you've got a train that's 2 to 3 miles long. You've only got 2 people. It's a 2-person crew. It's a 2-person crew. And one of the fights on the part of the union is trying to at least have 3 workers. And the bosses, the rail bosses, have been complaining about that. They won't. So you see all of the safety issues, how it affects communities and so on. But it's the politics of this. The politics, the fact that the union was not able to use its power, the power of the union, to challenge the bosses. And they couldn't use it because of the state, the political system, the political system. And that's what I really want to, again, focus my remarks on. I think we're in this situation. I think the basic claim I want to make tonight is because the working class doesn't have its own political party. We're the only advanced capitalist country in which the working class does not have its own political party. And there's a good reason for that. There's a history to that. And that's the dilemma that we find ourselves in. All the polls I've seen reveal that the public, never in my lifetime, have so many people been so dismayed at the prospects of who to vote for in next November. The choices they have. The choices they have. And you need to think about why are we in this situation. I can't remember. Gary, he's from my generation. I can't remember any time in the history of presidential voting in this country have the 2 candidates been so disliked. And the prospects that people may have to vote for one of them or abstain.
How about Johnson?
That's a very high possibility. And remember in 2016, in that election, the Trump-Clinton election, 41% of the electorate abstained. Didn't like their choices. And in 2020, about 33% of the electorate abstained, simply didn't like their choices. If that history is any indicator, that could be the same in 2024. If you don't like your choices, oftentimes you don't act, you abstain. I'm not going to the prom. I don't like my date choices. I got too much self-respect to deal with these two characters. But we have to ask ourselves again, why are we in this situation? What is the reason for this? In 2007, I encountered a movement I wasn't familiar with called the Impeach Bush movement. Liberals who were very upset with President Bush, the second Bush, who, looking at what he was doing in the Middle East, all the lies about Iraq, and there was this movement called the Impeach Bush movement. Some of you may be familiar with it, who were around at that particular time. And so I had to think a little bit about how to respond to it. not in some sectarian kind of way, but in a way that was really educational. And I settled on the following formulation. If you don't impeach the system that gave us Bush, we'll have someone in the White House who will make us long for Bush. That was my response. Again, if we don't impeach the system that gave us Bush, we'll have someone in the White House who will make us long for Bush. No, I didn't have a crystal ball that foresaw Donald Trump. I say the same now. If we don't impeach the system that gave us Trump, we'll have someone in the White House who will make us long for Trump. Think Tucker Carlson. Think Tucker Carlson. Far more dangerous, in my opinion, than Donald Trump. Again, the problem is the system that we have, the electoral system, and at the heart of it is a problem that the working class, our class, the working class does not have its own political party. We are forced into having to vote for the lesser evil. That's been a trend in U.S. politics for some time. And that's what I want to begin talking about, and how do we get into this situation. One of the things that struck me about the 2000 election, in which Bush got elected, was the way in which this was done. Effectively, if you think about it, okay, this is 2000. Remember Florida? Some of you may or may not read about what happened in Florida in 2000 and the hanging chads and all of this and the problem. And it goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that Bush was the winner. And I began thinking about this. It was, the more I thought about it, I found it weird and odd, especially as I'm looking at it from a comparative perspective, thinking about politics beyond the United States, maybe 90 miles away in Cuba, maybe in other parts of the world, in the third world. How would they respond to the fact? How would the masses respond to the fact that one person, unelected for a lifetime job, decided who would be president of the United States? That's effectively what happened. Sandra Day O'Connor was the deciding vote in that 5-4 decision. Sandra Day O'Connor, that was her vote. That was the deciding vote in that 5-4, a job unelected for life, an unelected position for a lifetime position, made that decision. The masses would have been in the streets in many, many other parts of the world. It speaks volumes about the socialization and the attitudes, issues of legitimacy within the United States. In 2019, the people of Puerto Rico didn't like their governor. They took to the streets. A third of the island came out and the masses forced the governor out of position. The last time it happened in the United States was in a colonial setting in 1676. The colonial governor in Virginia was forced out of office because the masses, there was a revolt that took to the streets, but not in 2000. So I'm trying to figure out what is it about the United States that people were willing to accept. And I began to realize that the people who voted for Al Gore, by the way, you can see all of this on C-SPAN. Go to C-SPAN archives and so on. You will see the deliberations in Congress. There are a couple of about 8 people who come over from the House of Representatives over to the Senate and ask the Senate not to overturn the Supreme Court decision, but can we just have a discussion about it? And there was no one in the Senate willing to have even a discussion about the Supreme Court decision. And guess who was in the Senate? Well, one is Al Gore himself. He's presiding over the Senate as the vice president. That's his job. He's presiding over this. He didn't object to what the Supreme Court did. Feingold from Wisconsin was also. Wellstone was also in the Senate. Yes, Wellstone was in the Senate. He was not willing to challenge that decision. That to me spoke volumes about the political system. Didn't want to rock the boat, and so did not want to rock the boat. Didn't want to maintain. Challenging the system would have been destabilizing in their opinion. So I began to think more and more about this, and I began to realize, based upon reading I was doing and research I was doing on Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution, and how Lenin made use of the electoral arena to carry out revolutionary politics, which we can talk about later. And I began to conclude that the people who voted for Gore were willing to register their opinion. They were willing to register their opinion, an important democratic right, but were not willing to impose their power. They were not willing to impose their will on the political system, which is what the masses do when they take to the streets. And what people in Puerto Rico did. The people in Puerto Rico were imposing their will. And so I began to think more and more about this and to make a distinction and to talk about what actually happens in voting. And I've come up with a term, as far as I know, it's original, and it's based upon language that Marx and Ingles employed, called this was their characterization of the liberals in the Reichstag, the first free elections that took place in Germany. And the Parliamentary Cretanism refers to the belief that what takes place in the legislative parliamentary arena is the end-all and be-all of politics. Is the end-all and be-all of politics, which Marx and Engels were very critical of. Their argument, no, real politics takes place outside the parliamentary arena, on the streets, on the picket lines, on the barricades, the battlefield. That's where power is imposed. That's where power is imposed. And with this term, and I began thinking about the voting process itself. At the time this took place, and up until really the end of the 19th century, the vast majority of the population simply didn't vote, didn't participate in the electoral process. It's not until really the First World War that we have universal male suffrage for the first time. Not until the First World War that we have universal male suffrage for the first time. And of course, women will not get the right to vote until later. In Switzerland, as late as 1971, when women will get the right to vote. African Americans don't get the right to vote in the United States until 1965. It's always important to remember. And so Marx and Engels didn't live long enough to see voting and how it actually operated and what people thought about it. So this is original on my part, what I call voting fetishism. And by voting fetishism, I mean the mistaken belief that when we vote, we're exercising political power. I get that's a mistake. When we vote, we exercise an important democratic right to register a preference for a candidate or a policy. It's an important democratic right. We've all benefited from in many ways. First time I tried to vote in New Orleans in 1964, I wasn't allowed to vote because of my skin color. I was told, come back in 2 weeks and try again. I didn't get a chance. I was on my way to graduate school and didn't get a chance to get back and try again. 4 years later, I was able to vote. 1968. So you have to explain. So what happened in between 1964 and 1968?
Voting Rights Act.
And Voting Rights Act, and why was the Voting Rights Act? How did we get the Voting Rights Act?
Can I get a Protesting.
in the streets.
Marching.
We were in the streets. We were exercising power. We were imposing our will on the political system. And if you push the clock back, that's how all of us got the right to vote. Think about it. Ask yourself, why is it until the 19th century that we even begin thinking about the idea of universal suffrage, universal male suffrage? It's not until the 19th century. You think about class society and voting, you can go back to Athens. There was voting in Athens. It was limited. Very, very limited. Well, the basic reason is that elites, the elites in society and class society were always very fearful about giving the vote to those of us who didn't have wealth. The fear that we would use the vote to impose our will to affect their wealth. That's why oftentimes when voting is granted, there are all kinds of property, the property question, the property qualification. I've been studying political science for years and all of the things we do in political science classes, but I only learned about this reality of voting when I was watching a TV program about South Africa and apartheid in 1993. And the interviewer was talking to the Prime Minister of apartheid in South Africa. Why don't you can't you just give blacks the right to vote? He said, what are you talking about? If they got the right to vote, then they will come after our property. They will come after our property. He was very clear. That to me it was perfect. The kind of class that I wish I had had in a political science course. But it was the property. It really was the property. The fear that once our side, once those without wealth got the right to vote, they would use the vote to impose their will, to infringe upon the property of the wealthy. That's the reason why we so long delayed. By the time of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, the capitalists had figured out how to deal with this problem. And one of their favorite, most important institutions are central banks. The central banks, like the Federal Reserve. Why you and I don't get a chance to vote on the decisions of the Federal Reserve. Decisions that affect all of us. Will affect whether or not we're going to have jobs. Think about interest rates now. The rising interest rates and impact. It's not an accident you and I don't get a chance to vote on the decisions of the Federal Reserve. And it was set up in 1913. It was made sure it was walled off from the electorate. That's the way it was designed. And that decision in 1913 was simply a continuation of earlier decisions. If you haven't had a chance recently, go back and read the Constitution. It's one of the first assignments in one of my classes. First assignment, you read the Communist Manifesto along with the U.S. Constitution to see which of the two documents talks about democracy. And oftentimes students are very surprised to see that the word democracy has never ever appeared in the U.S. Constitution. Never. Even after the Civil War. You would think after the Civil War, maybe, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Even after 1971, when 18-year-olds got the right to vote. You would think the lawyers who composed these amendments would think maybe you can put democracy in the document. It's not. It's an important document. In my opinion, it was an advance given the reality of political systems prior to 1789. I think it was an important development that we should be sober about what was accomplished and what was not accomplished. That's the unfinished business. It's to bring real democracy. That would be with a socialist revolution in the United States. Those who lead and bring about that revolution will not be squeamish about putting the word democracy in a new constitution. That's exactly what the Bolsheviks did in their 1918 constitution. What the document registers is the fact that government of the rich, for the rich, and by the rich. And a lot of the document is about the protection of property. It's a property question. The property question. One of the most progressive feature of the document, of course, is the Bill of Rights. And that was one in struggle. The framers were forced to have to add the Bill of Rights. But one of the surprises I learned, again, no political science course taught me, it was only through working with the Socialist Workers' Party in election campaigns, I learned about the fact that the Bill of Rights does not apply to the private sector. Kip can tell you when he got fired for speaking, for being interviewed. It was an interview, I think. Yeah. He learned that he didn't have freedom of speech. Yeah. The railroad bosses say sorry. Yeah. And the ACLU, I remember we went to the ACLU, can you defend the person who had gotten fired? And the ACLU said, so we'd love to help you, but we can't. We can't because the Bill of Rights does not apply to the private sector. It's only about what government can or cannot do, which is important. I'm not diminishing that at all. It's very, very important. But that's no accident. It's no accident, indeed, that we have a document that first and foremost defends and protects property. It's the property question. I can't emphasize enough the importance of the role of property, private property, in the history of class society. I want to come back to that. But again, yeah, my argument is that when we are voting, we are registering our preferences, an important democratic conquest to register our preferences for either a candidate or a particular policy. That's what we're doing. Yeah, we're not exercising power. Power means to impose your will. Think about it. How long does it take to vote? What, a minute? You do it as an individual. No two things could be as foreign to power as doing something that's brief and alone. No two things could be as foreign to what is involved in imposing one's will, political power. Something that's brief, and you do it as an individual. Again, it's an important democratic right, and what Lenin, Marx, and Ingles taught is how to use that important democratic right to carry out a revolutionary project. In other words, for Marx, Ingles, and Lenin, voting was not an end in itself, but a means to an end. It was a means to an end. And Marx lays it out, Ingles laid it out in that 11-page document in 1850 called the address, the 1850 March address of the Communist League. The two most important things about voting is, for revolutionaries, for revolutionary Marxists, is to use it as to educate. You get out your ideas, your program. It's a great opportunity to go and talk about what you stand for, what your program is. Great opportunity. And then secondly, it's a way to test your strength. What portions of the population are voting for your candidates and so on. It's a way to test your strength to determine when is the appropriate time to carry out a revolution. Those are the two kernels of wisdom in that 1850 document. And I claim that no one grasped the importance of that wisdom and those ideas as much as Lenin did. My Lenin book doesn't claim to be about anything that's really original. All I did in the Lenin book was to do a deep dive into the 45 volumes of Lenin. No one had done that before, looking at Lenin's electoral approach, ideas about the parliamentary ring. When I was writing the book, I would get the strange look on some people's faces. Lenin, voting, parliament, what are you talking about? No. Yes, let me explain. No, for Lenin, this was extremely important. Extremely important. And Lenin says after the revolution, in his book on infantile, left-wing communism and infantile disorder, he talks about how how using elections in the parliamentary arena was indispensable, he says. Indispensable in the Bolsheviks coming to power. That's his claim. Using the electoral parliamentary arena. So again, but not as an end in itself. And that is what began to distinguish between what came to be called the communist movement and the social democratic movement. Up until 1914, Lenin employed the label social democrat. That's the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. That's the party he belonged to. He belonged to the Bolshevik wing. There was the Menshevik wing, there was the Bolshevik wing, but he always called himself a social democrat, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. That changed. That changed because of the First World War. Lenin felt important to make a distinction between those social democrats who voted to support the First World War, voted for the war credits, versus those who objected. And he thought the way to make that distinction was to use the term communist as opposed to the social democrats. So up until then, he was comfortable, even though Marx and Ingles had expressed issues around the term social democracy, but he was willing to make use of that label. But once the German party, the German socialists voted to vote to support the war, vote to fund the war, that was seen as a betrayal of the communist project. And specifically, there was a manifesto in 1912 called the Basel Manifesto, in which parties who belonged to the Second International, the Socialist International, were obligated, if a war began, these parties were obligated to vote against funding the war. The German party violated that agreement. And for Lenin and others, that was, at first they couldn't believe it, that the Germans had actually, the German party, because they always looked up to the German party. In fact, that German party voted for the war credits and so on. It was a real, it caused, for Lenin, a kind of a moment of anguish, political anguish. He did a deep dive into Hegel. He didn't go back to Marx, he went to Hegel. He wanted to go to the origins of Marx and Engels. Deep dive into how do you make sense of this? How do you make sense of what happened in Germany? So that's when the distinction began. But yes, the two things I think I've done originally in the Lenin book is to come up with this concept of voting fetishism. We can have a discussion if people are unsatisfied with it, and so I'm always open to, and I learn from these kinds of discussions about how to make sure I explain what I'm talking about. And the second original claim I make about the Lenin book is that I'm able to trace from Marx and Engels' 1850 document about how to use elections strategically for making a revolution. I argue that that document is the playbook that Lenin employed for 1917, if not before. That's the claim that I'm making in the book. I trace so-called, trace the dots, connect the dots between Marx and Engels and what Lenin did. And I think, as far as I can tell, I'm the first person. Even in Trotsky's magisterial, the history of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky's great work. But Trotsky doesn't make that connection either between Marx and Engels and what the Bolsheviks were able to do. So those are the only two original things I do in the Lenin book. Everything else is really just a deep dive into the 45 volumes of Lenin. And they're very, very rich. And one of the things I have to grapple with is why haven't other people looked at this? After the peasant question, I think the electoral revolutionary parliamentary question Ingles employed, as he called it, I think is perhaps the next most discussed topic, because he begins employing it in 1905 with the 1905 revolution, the first time the elections come to Russia. So the Bolsheviks got to figure out, well, how do you participate in an election? And you know that what the regime is trying to do is oftentimes with elections are forced upon the regime as a way to get the masses out of the streets. We'll give them the vote. We can bring the revolution to an end. Give them the right to vote. That happened, by the way, during the Civil Rights Movement. That was a big issue in the Civil Rights Movement. When the Kennedy administration began talking about voting rights for blacks. And there was a big debate inside the Civil Rights, especially the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Should we go along with Kennedy's voting rights program? We know what Kennedy is trying to do. He wants us to end the protests. The protests are embarrassing for U.S. foreign policy and everything. Just get them out of the streets. Give them the right to vote. So that's a big debate in the Civil Rights Movement, whether or not to go along. And the decision is to. We'll go along with it. They did not know, unfortunately, the Lenin strategy. And so for many people who went into it were very disappointed, demoralized, especially 1964 Atlanta, the Democratic Party convention. A key figure from Minnesota, Walter Mondale, plays a key role in co-opting the Civil Rights Movement. Mondale's role at the Atlanta. There are a group of black activists out of Mississippi and Alabama. They're trying to use the electoral process in if not a revolutionary way, in a radical way in order to bring about real change. But they get co-opted into the Democratic Party. And therein, I argue, if you ever wonder whatever happened to the Civil Rights Movement, there's a slogan I sometimes use called, out of the streets into the suites. That's not original on my part, but that was from the time. So people would say, whatever happened to the Civil Rights Movement? Out of the streets into the suites. And this is what happens at the Atlanta Convention in 1964. And it leads to a lot of demoralization. There's a new book on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which 1966, you really see the demoralization, including, sadly, this is when SNCC makes its decision to purge its white members. That decision comes out of the demoralization that comes with the involvement in the Democratic Party. And that decision, sadly, in my opinion, I think unfortunately, progressives have never come to grips with that decision. I think it has an echo within the Black Lives Movement. That decision to either purge white members or relegate them to second-class status. That's what happened within the SNCC. And it had a lasting impact. I didn't realize as I was working with some old SNCC veterans organizing a conference on the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. We did it over at the Humphrey in 2015, and we invited some people, veterans from SNCC. But you could see they were wounded. They were wounded people who came out of that, and really, many of them felt very betrayed by that decision and so on. But as I think more about it, that decision, that purge decision, really comes out the demoralization that came with going into the Democratic Party. All right, I've gone longer than I intended. Sorry, because I really want to open it up to the discussion. I can see people have questions and a lot of doubts and skepticism. That's good. In 1893, by then, working class parties were coming into formation in Europe. The big breakthroughs beginning in 1875. Marx and Ingles played an extremely important role in laying out the groundwork for the organization of labor parties and working class parties in Europe. The first one was really Germany in 1869. But then, beginning about 1875, coming out of a conference of the First International, a decision is made that the working class it was in the working class interest to begin organizing politically. There was a big fight in the International with the anarchists. The anarchists didn't see the need for political parties. The anarchist argument was that you get into the electoral process, you get betrayed, you can't trust these bourgeois politicians and so on. That was a big fight within the First International, and Marx and Ingles, after battling with the anarchists and so on, persuaded the International that from here on, the International encourages parties to begin forming labor parties. All right, in 1893, Ingles gets a letter. Marx dies in 1883. Ingles gets a letter from a comrade here in the United States who's bemoaning the fact that we're having difficulty trying to form a labor party here in the United States. It's just not working. Do you got any advice for us and so on? And Ingles writes back and said, look, yeah, it's going to be difficult to form a labor party in the United States. You got three obstacles, he said. The first obstacle is your voting method, what do you call it, what is it, just the British method, unlike the proportional representation.
First past the post.
First past the post. The winner take all. The winner take all, first past the post method of voting. That's a problem, he said. That's a structural problem that you face. But he says there are two other problems, perhaps more fundamental. One, the United States was the land of opportunity for the working class. The westward movement of the working class. The opportunity to get out of the working class. Many a revolutionary and a radical came to the United States with radical credentials, but you get a piece of land, the American dream, moving up the social ladder and so on. Yeah, you begin to, I'm not so sure I'm really into revolutionary politics anymore. And that happened. There were all kinds of people from the German Revolution. They got a piece of land, they went to Wisconsin somewhere, never heard from them before, lost. The upper nobility, that was a fact. That was a fact. Thirdly, the divisions within the working class. The divisions within the working class. And two in particular, the native born versus the foreigners. Yeah, the chauvinism, anti-foreign attitudes within the working class. And of course, the Negro problem is, in other words, the racism within the working class. Those divisions, Ingles said, made it very, very difficult for a labor party to get off the ground in the United States. But he ended on an optimistic note. He was optimistic that the conditions would one day exist in the United States for a labor party to get off the ground. And I'm more convinced of what Ingles foresaw than ever, given all the changes that have taken place. On the structural problem, the nature of electoral system, that's still very much in place. The winner take all, first past the post electoral system. But Minnesota proves you can get a third party off the ground. Something called, remember, the former Labor Party. There once was a working class party in Minnesota. And the Minnesota story, I think, is very important for all of us to look at what actually happened. Because here you see how a third party a working class party can get off the ground, but how it can get co-opted. That formally happens in 1944. The merger of the Democrats. Up until then, there was real serious consideration on the part of the Democrats and the Republicans for merging into one party. They realized they had more in common than they had with it. But if they had merged into one party, that would have left the working class. The possibilities for a real working class party, very promising, very promising. And so that decision, I learned later that there were some people in my department, I had no idea, they were part of those negotiations and discussions. John Turner was very much a part. I didn't realize that. I learned, Bob Holt told me about this. And they were doing it in combination with Hubert Humphrey. They were all close friends of Hubert Humphrey in bringing about this merger. But it's true, by the by 1944, the former Labor Party really had seen its best days. And a part of the reason with the former Labor Party, it came out of the Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party really, even with the best of its moments, because of the Eugene V. Debs phenomenon, they really did believe, they tended to suffer from voting fetishism and this. They really believed that Debs, through the electoral campaigns and so on, this is the way in which the working class, you could bring about real change. And the former Labor Party inherited that notion from the socialists. And so throughout their 4 year, remember the elections, gubernatorial elections were every 2 years in Minnesota then. But for 4 straight elections, gubernatorial elections, the former Labor Party won. But it tended to convince them that the electoral road, they were into elections and so on, that's the way power was achieved. And it was that weakness on the part of them that made them vulnerable, to the entreaties of the Democratic Party for the merger in 19. This is important. Yeah, again, Minnesota illustrates that, yes, the electoral system can be an obstacle, but it is possible for the third party to get off the ground, and that's what happened here. As far as the other 2 factors, the American dream, that I think, I don't know about you, and that's a discussion we can have. Yeah, I think the American dream has come to an end for the vast majority of the working class. I think, yeah, we got data in which we can see this. The economists here at the University of Minnesota, anyone born after 1980 has a less than even chance of having the same lifestyle chances as their parents. You're born after you all can tell me more about than I can. Yeah, our generation, yeah, that was it. That was the American dream. When I first applied for a job at the University of Minnesota in 1971, we had maybe 32 full-time positions in political science, about 32. Yeah. Out of a population of 250 million, the US population, 200. Today we have maybe about 28 full-time positions out of a population of 330 million. 330 million people. In other words, declining opportunity. And you wonder why the tribalism, the polarization comes from. As the pie is shrinking, I want to make sure my people, my group, gets its slice. The fight over the size of the slice of the pie, and why things like affirmative action or whatever they are called today, yeah, all of that breeds competition within the working class. But yeah, I think it's the American dream is over, and sadly, the most as people know, the infant mortality rates, life expectancy rates for the working class, yeah, are declining. That's been a reality now for some time. All kinds of things account for it. The fentanyl is just a part of it, but all of the alienation, all of the lack of adequate health care and so on, cutbacks on the social safety net and so on. All of that, I think, speaks volumes and is evidence for me about that. And it's in that context, in that right-wing forces can get a hearing. In a deep radicalization, always remember, in a deep radicalization, the radicalization can be on both the left and the right. That's what Germany taught us. And there will be all kinds of forces there who will be parading in the name of the working class. We should never forget the official name of Hitler's party. The official name of Hitler's party was the National German Socialist Workers' Party. That was the official name. The line of the fascists was, we're for the working class as long as they're Germans. We're for the working class as long as they're for Germans. That's what, in my opinion, no one plays that out more. Our side has been given a reprieve until he gets a new slot somewhere, but he's been reduced to Twitter. 10 minutes on Twitter, and I'm referring, of course, to Tucker Carlson. But there will be some capitalists there who will see there's money to be made with Tucker Carlson to bring him back on and give him more airtime. But no one, this is why I'm saying I think he was far more dangerous than Trump. Very conscious of that. You know, if ever there were to be a fascist movement in the United States, I think we would be able to trace it. We would be able to trace it to someone like Tucker Carlson. So I don't, in a deep, the end of the American dream offers opportunities not only on the left, but also on the right. And it depends a lot on what we do, what progressive forces do. It depends a lot on what we do. And then on the race question, I think, and be curious to hear what people think. Sometimes when I say this in the classroom, I think there's less racism in the United States today than there's ever been. I think there's less racism than there's ever been. And I've got a few years I can talk about that. I can remember the days when white supremacy was triumphant. I can remember the days where I would not have been allowed to be in your company with many of you. That was when white supremacy was triumphant. Here in Minnesota, where the George Floyd protests began, is something we shouldn't take for granted. Some of you may take it for granted, that's good, but you shouldn't. And that is the multiracial character of the anti-police brutality protest today. In the 1960s, believe me, anti-police brutality protests were exclusively African Americans. In fact, if you saw a white person nearby might actually lose their life in the proximity. That happened as late as 1992 in Los Angeles with a white truck driver. We shouldn't take for granted the multiracial composition of the protest. One of the examples I like to use is 1920 Duluth, Minnesota, 2020 Duluth, Minnesota. You can go online, Google Duluth, Minnesota 1920, and you will see images of 10,000 residents in the streets cheering on the lynching of 3 black men. That's Duluth. Bob Dylan has actually written, there's a song, there's a tune that Bob Dylan, who's from the range, has written about what happened in Duluth. That's 1920. Fast forward to 2020. Thousands of people in the streets protesting what happened to George Floyd. To me, that speaks volumes about what has changed in the United States. In other words, something happened between 1920 and 2020. Something happened in the United States. And I claim it was that mass movement in the streets of what was sometimes known today as the Civil Rights Movement, which is mostly a black-led proletarian movement. It changed attitudes within, that made it possible, that's what made it possible for there to be interracial marches here in 2020 throughout small town Minnesota. That was also the key. And we can't take for granted the juries, the half-white jury that convicted Chauvin, or in the case of Dante Wright, those are in Georgia, the jury that was in New Brunswick, Georgia. Oh, the idea that you would get a near majority white jury convicting police of killing a black person, no. If white supremacy was triumphant, that would not happen. This is not to minimize the racism that still exists within the United States. But I'm trying to get you to think about the opportunities we have today. It's the opportunities we have today to organize and to come together and to begin thinking as a class. As long as the ruling class wants us to think as first and foremost as a particular identity. The last thing they want us to think about as a class. If you don't believe it, think about all of the corporate funding that went to Black Lives Movement. When's the last time corporations gave money to unions? When is the last time? When did the Target Foundation give money to unions? They want us, it's in their interest for us to think ourselves first and foremost as a member of a particular race or identity, rather than as a member of the working class. And it's my argument, the basic premise of the Marxist perspective, the revolutionary Marxist perspective, is that only the working class has an inherent interest in ending class society. Only the working class. The reason for that is it's only with the end of private property. Only with the end of private property is the working class free. If you think about what it means to be a worker. It means to be a worker means that you have to sell your labor to somebody to eat. So if you ever wanted to know whether or you're in the working class, ask yourself, do you have to sell your labor to somebody to survive? If you do, welcome to the working class. And the working class, again, only with the end of private property. It's because somebody owns this. It's their property. The railroads. Yeah, those railroads are that's private property. The protection of price, that's what the state does. All of the problems you saw in that clip with the railroad, all of that could be brought to an end if those railroads became national property. They were owned by the public. And I'll just, some comrades I know who went to Cuba recently interviewed some of the railroad workers in Cuba. Yeah, you got it's national land on the railroads. You got five people on the crew on these trains. They're not 2 miles long, and so that's the reality of when the working class actually has political power. So yeah, I want to make a case for it. I realize that we oftentimes attracted to the lesser of two evils. And yes, whether or not Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy and so on. And that will be what the Democratic Party that will be its main campaign slogan. Its main campaign slogan. Yeah, anything but Trump. Anything but Trump. And we will have to ask ourselves, why do we find ourselves in this position? You know, we don't know. Every delay in putting off forming a Labor Party, I think only makes a Trump-like scenario more possible. We keep delaying, keep looking for the answer. No, we got to keep our Trump and so on. But this is the system we have. This is the system we have based upon those past decisions of not wanting to break and form the working class, forming its own Labor Party. A Labor Party that actually fights, has a fighting program. We have lots of Labor Parties around the world, by the way, but not all of them are fighting Labor Parties. Not all of them. I mean, we all have examples, I'm sure, in mind. So, but it's a fighting program that actually fights, mobilizes its members to actually carry out fights. Okay, so I'm sorry, I went longer than
That's all right. Thank you so
You want
much.
to share this? Yeah.
Sure.